The following program is intended for an adult audience. It is separate from my work or that of any guest with any other entity. Welcome to the Education Upgrade Podcast. I'm your host, Jake Schlofsky. To support this podcast, please subscribe on YouTube and check out the links in the description. I'm here today with Dr. Sebastián Sclofsky. Dr. Sclofsky is an associate professor of criminal justice at California State University, Stanislaus. He teaches courses on critical criminology, social theory, criminal justice, policing, and police violence. His research focuses on capitalist state violence, in particular police violence, Marxism, socioeconomic inequalities, and racism in Brazil, South America's Southern Cone, and the United States. He has also studied the development of tough-on-crime policies and the import of U.S.-based policing strategies in Latin America, particularly Uruguay. Good afternoon, Dr. Sclofsky. Thanks for being here, man.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It was my pleasure. I think it's worth mentioning like how we met.
Yeah.
If you don't mind that.
No problem.
So I suppose I could let you tell the story because we were just talking about your son.
Yeah.
And your perspective as a father. And
Yeah.
I think maybe your perspective as a father on what happened and how we got into contact is worth starting.
So one afternoon my son comes back from school a little bit angry, and I ask him what has happened, and he tells me that there was a random dog search in his classroom that took place, and annoyed him quite a bit that a police search took place in the classroom without notice and so on. So I asked him what he wanted to do. So he said oh, you should email and complain about it and so on. I said you are the one going to school. So for me, it's easy to email, but no, you should say something and so on. So I decided that I was going to write to the principal, not necessarily complaining, but, highlighting the problems of having random searches in school, random police searches in school and in classrooms in the way that it was done, and the ineffectiveness of that and so on. So I wrote the email, and I find it, important to copy his teachers so they are aware that, that he was, negatively impacted by this. So I wrote the email. I showed him the email. I said, I'm going to, are you fine with it? I'm going to send it to everybody. I'm copying all your teachers. And I sent it. And that's how, I got a response from the principal. The response was expected. Not very satisfactory from my perspective, but I understand, it's policy, and I don't know how much leeway that an administrator of a school has regarding those elements.
Mm-hmm.
But that's how, then you reach out and show interest on what I thought about it and larger issues of policing in schools.
Yeah, I thought your email was definitely interesting. I knew prior to this, so full disclosure, your son's in my class right now, and that's how I saw the email. And I saw the email, and I was like, wow, evidence-based perspectives, interesting points, and it sounds like there's a lot of nuance to this from someone who is an expert on these kinds of things. I would love to hear more about what you have to say. So we got together for a little chat that turned into almost 4 hours of us talking and a couple of beers, and it was a great chat because the subject is so nuanced and so complex. Yeah. And so it's not as simple as we don't want teenagers to be exposed to drugs in school. Let's do drug dog searches and that'll solve it.
Yeah, or the other way around. We don't want teenagers, we don't want police in school, so let's, take them out. I think that there's a complexity to the issue, and with all social phenomena and social problems, issues are complex.
Yeah.
And this belief that we can, apply ready-made recipes to solve these issues, there's a series of layers of complexity that need to be unpacked and contextualized. And I find, that for the last 20, 30 years, the deployment of police school resource officers and all these type of search and so on has been a strategy that it's not well thought in all its aspects, and there's no in my view, there's no, from an educational perspective, there's no really thought on what exactly are we trying to achieve. It's, you know, it's based on a very carceral logic of surveillance, of control, of enforcing order, not necessarily achieving, you know, as I put on the email, and the data shows that these type of searches are very ineffective. You know, the ability for police, and including with dogs, to find contraband is very low. I think that it's, you know, on the level of, you know, best case scenario, you're going to find a 5% effectiveness, in the sense that you're going to find, you know, in for every 100, 5 times you'll find something. And there's a high level of, you know, false positives regarding dogs, and also, you know, false negatives and so on. So it's not an effective tool. But there's little thought of, you know, if this is not an effective tool, why it's being deployed, and what is it that it's trying to achieve. And it's less thought from an educational perspective what it's trying to achieve, or what actually is the impact of that. I think that, you know, they're ready-made things that are deployed in a very uncritical way. So, yeah.
Yeah, the nuances of how it might, what gave me a lot to think about, because something I'm very passionate about, is how is this actually affecting the students?
Yeah.
Psychologically, and like you said, what is the goal?
Yeah.
Because the goal is, I mean, it seems like the goal is behavior modification, right?
Yeah.
Like we want certain students to stop bringing contraband to school.
Yeah, but again, what is the idea behind? You know, let's assume that it's effective. It's not. So let's be clear. It's not an effective tool to find contraband. Okay? But let's assume that it is. And let's assume that the dogs go in and the police goes in and they find in a student, in a student backpack, they find drugs. Okay, fine, fantastic. You find drugs. What is it that you're trying to achieve with that? What is it that you want to modify? Okay, so these are a series of unsustained hypotheses that I'm throwing here, okay? Because none of what I'm saying here is actually achievable. But let's assume that you can achieve that effect, that you actually find something, which in most cases you won't, that you know the student that gets it, and let's say that you are able to modify that behavior that the student says, you punish, and that the student stops bringing drugs into school. Like, even if you achieve all that stuff, what is it exactly that you're achieving here? Because that student, you're not looking at why the student is bringing drugs into school. What is the context that this is happening? Why are students consuming or buying? Why are students selling? And, okay, they're not doing it in schools. They're doing it on the park behind. And then there's a series of other side effects that may be more detrimental than the actual, medicine that you're trying to provide. And if you think of the school, and this is pure theory here, and I'm being naive for a moment, but if you think of the school as a transformative institution, rather than a disciplinary institution, you're not providing any tool or any type of transformative effect in society, because you're not, giving the students as a group, or the students or society, as a whole, the understanding of why these things are happening in society, but actually you're reinforcing this idea, this false assumption that both consuming drugs or selling drugs or buying drugs is a question of individual choice, of rational individuals, completely decontextualized from the realities that we are in, and that therefore, if I increase the cost of doing that, then as a rational individual that does a cost-benefit analysis is going to say, like, well, I'm going to stop doing. So we're going back to, good old Nancy Reagan and there's Just Say No campaign, completely, as if drug addiction and consumption was a choice. While all the evidence is showing that not. So that's my point. My point is, what is it? And I would expect from... I know teachers do it, and that's what's part of my purpose of of sending the email to teachers, because at least my experience has been, not always, but at least in the context of middle school that you work, has been very positive with my son's teachers. But I want to push administrators and those who design education policy to actually think about education rather than think of, discipline and control and surveillance and punishment and, that what it's called in my world, the carceral logic. And think about what are the side effects. So much of the side effects that the literature shows and research shows and we know is, students starts to become suspicious. Students start to, lose trust on their teachers. They lose trust on their fellow classmates. Everybody becomes a suspect, right? There's suspicion, like if you think from a police perspective, well, the suspicion towards the police because that's the person that is conducting the search and, treating all of us as a potential criminal and definitely all of us as a suspect. And how can and it reduces, what the literature shows, it reduces trust on teachers, it reduces trust on schools, it reduces complete trust in the institution. And I would assume that the last thing that a teacher wants is their students not to trust them. So if we go back to the issue of drugs, from an educational perspective, I would assume that it would be much better for a student to be able to be open to the student and say, hey, I have this issue. Or, I don't know, I'm selling drugs because I want to make ends meet or whatever. But be able to have that conversation and try to understand the context in which it's happening and why it's happening and see how can, that be transformed and so on, rather than punishing. And if you think also from a policing perspective, and, we may go there and so on, but as much as, police officer might be, most of, at least my experience, most, not all, but most of the school resource officers that I've met during my research and in my time are really wonderful people who are there, really convinced to help and so on. Not all, you have exceptions everywhere, but still. But they're not educators. It's not their role. It's not their function. Not only that, we need to understand what police represents also, and what is their function in society, to understand if the institution, not necessarily the individual, but the institution, if it's a good idea to bring that institution inside schools in the way that it's being brought. I'm not saying that they should exclude it. That's a discussion to have, but in the way that it's being brought. So it's important to understand. It's important to understand what police represent, in order to understand, okay, what is it, the role that it should fulfill, and what are the limits of that.
I definitely want to talk about that more, the role of police and what authority actually is. It's worth commenting, though, on the subject of trust. It's something I've talked about on podcasts with other guests before, the role of trust in the effectiveness of teaching and student learning. And we know from the research of John Hattie, for one, and his giant meta-analysis he did, that content matter expertise of an instructor is basically valueless in the K-12 environment. When you get into higher academic specializations, you need expertise, then it's valuable. But for me as a middle school teacher,
I'm not sure that I wouldn't extend even to the academic field, maybe with some nuances, but information, I wouldn't say knowledge, but information, it's at the palm of our hand. It's like at the touch of our fingers now.
Yes. Everything you learn in my course is on YouTube.
Yeah. Everything. So, the ability to understand, to process that information, to distinguish between good and bad information, those are the things that we need, not only at the school level, but also at the university level, to develop that critical ability to, understand that things are complex, that things need, widespread analysis, that, and to be able to, to figure out, okay, what is good, what are good sources, what are bad, what is good information, and so on, and moving on.
And to learn, I absolutely agree, and to for that kind of learning to take place, the students need intellectual safety.
Yes.
They need to be able to take risks.
Yeah.
They need to be allowed to fail without there being risk. And that requires trust.
Yeah.
They have to have trust with the instructor. And that's the most important thing is relationships between the instructor and the student. And when we talked, it made me wonder, like, do these policing measures in the school, do they undermine my relationship of trust with the students?
Yes. So the answer is yes, they do. Because you are put in a very tough position. Because let's go back to the story that started this or sparked this. So my son was like, he was angry. And I think that part of him asking me to send an email and to copy the teachers was he was expecting some type of reaction. So that puts you in a tough spot because, okay, so, because am I going to defy the authorities? Am I going to, and side with the student? Which I know, things are much more complex than taking sides. You can navigate. But there's some type of expectation for you to take side, and that you shouldn't be put in that position as a teacher. And not only that, the issue, it's also a taboo in which nobody discusses policing in schools, in the school. Mm-hmm. There's no conversation among teachers in the classrooms or with the principal and so on saying, okay, should we involving the students on should we have a police officer on campus? What should be the role of the police officer? Why should we have a police officer on campus? What should be the role? What should be the limits? Why should we have it and so on? Why not involve students? Mm-hmm. Why not? I'm not saying that they should, maybe they shouldn't be the ones in charge of making the decision. But why not why not involve them on that? If we are bombarding them with messages of, going back to the issue of drugs, we're bombarding them with messages of say no, say no, say no. So we expect them to make we don't give them the tools to make those decisions, but we expect them to make that decision of saying no to drugs, okay, which is problematic in itself, all that campaign, but regardless of it. So why not we have a discussion on, on other elements that happen in the context of the school? Maybe not making the decision, but at least involve them. At least explain them, okay, this is the logic behind it. And listen to what they have to say. Listen to, what, how, may affect them, how they feel about it. Because then you can deal with that, Maybe not make them, I would make them part in the decision, but that's a different story. But let's say the decision is made. Okay, have a conversation. Explain the logic behind it. Explain the rationale. Listen to their, to their complaints, mm-hmm. and deal with it. But it's it's like a little bit that the response that I got. Well, it's policy. Here's the person, on the district that you can talk with. And yeah. So
that's predictable, though.
Yeah, of course it was predictable. I wasn't expecting something different. And I understand. I'm not, I'm not criticizing on that sense. But part of the issue here is that one of the trends that we see with this in the last years, and it has to do with larger developments, is that more and more we are reducing your function in schools. We had this conversation when we were having a beer, but I think it's worthwhile bringing it up. You are taking out from the most important educational places in the school with this, this carceral mentality of surveillance, control, discipline, punishment, and so on. Okay, so now the person in charge of discipline and punishment is a police officer and the administrators. Okay, they are the ones who control the playground. I don't know how you say it in English, but the backyard or the recess area and so on. You are closed inside the classroom. The most significant educational area in a school is not the classroom. It's the restroom, it's the corridors, is the surrounding park areas and so on. But you have been excluded from all those areas, And the people who have been put in charge of those areas have been guard duties, police officers, and so on, which are not educators. I'm not saying that they're bad people. I'm not saying that they cannot educate, but they're not educators. Mm-hmm. The educators are, enclosed in the classroom. Now, that has to do with a lot of trends, and part of it has to do, at the end of the day, with money.
Yeah.
Okay? If I want my teachers to be involved, I need to pay them more. Mm-hmm. And I need them to give them more release time.
Yeah, free up their time and hire more teachers.
Yes. Free up if I want you to be in the in all those spaces, which are the significant spaces in school. Okay, I cannot ask you at the same time to teach 5 or 6 courses. I don't know how many 7 periods there are, or 8 periods.
We just went to a 6-period schedule, and I teach 5 of them.
Okay, so you teach 5 periods.
Yes.
Okay. I need to release you from some of those periods so you can spend time in those spaces and have the significant conversations to have with the students. Now, I know, so people say, well, that may not be the role of the teacher, may be the role of counselors. How many counselors are in the school?
4 counselors for 1,400 students.
For 1,400 students.
Yeah.
We have, in university, I am not sure what I'm going to say, so don't take my word on it, but I seriously doubt that I'm wrong, but probably we have more police officers than counselors at the university. Probably. I may be wrong. Probably. Definitely the budget of policing at the university is 10 or 20 times higher than the counselor's budget. That's for sure.
Without a doubt.
Without a doubt. So if your point was, well, teachers are not counselors, maybe counselors, okay, no problem. Bring more counselors and have them there. If that's, if you want even a more specialized person. But to ask a police officer with all the goodwill of that individual to deal with all that stuff, it's like basically, I always have this argument. To ask the police to solve the crime problem is to put the police in a path to fail.
Yeah.
So if you care about the officers and you care about police, don't put them to solve things that they cannot solve. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't play a part in it, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't have an important part of it. They have, or they may, and so on, and it's a discussion to have. But to be the sole institution to solve a complex social phenomena is to put them in a path to fail. Everybody knows it. Talk to retired police officers, and which is something that, I talk to actual police officers that are retired.
Yes.
Actual have a problem because they're in the job, but when we talk anonymously, they share. They know. They're intelligent people, right. And they have a lot of experience. Absolutely. They know.
Yes.
They know. Of course, everybody's fighting for budget, so nobody's going to assume, well, I cannot do the job, because if you assume that, they say, okay, we're going to take the money from you and give it to somebody else. But going back to schools, it's an important. We are this movement towards the transformation of schools into, this carceral logic. Of police officers, of discipline, of punishment, of zero tolerance, of all that stuff that are, part of a problematic and ineffective criminal justice system that we have. And you put that into the school system. Schools are not, they're not educational places anymore. Nothing resembles. I was talking to a former corrections officer. And we were both saying that nothing resembles more like a prison than a school today. From an architectural perspective.
Yes. We call it the cells and bells design.
Yeah. It's from an architecture, the hours, the regime to go to the restroom, the regime to go into the corridors, all these issues with passes. I had to pick up my son the other day to go to the dentist, and I was asked documentation that I've never asked, I've never, I understand, and it's important, but it's I was okay, when I was in high school, I would go to the office and say, hey, I need to leave. And, if they didn't trust me, they would pick up the phone and say, wait, we need to check this. And they would pick up the phone and say, hey, does Sebastián needs to leave? Yes, he has to go to the dentist. And I would go. Sometimes not even parents would, I would, go and take the public bus and go. Now it's you need to go through a whole process of, layers of surveillance, of control, of stuff like that. And at the end of the day, despite the huge problems that exist, and despite the violence that exists, and despite, the gun violence that exists in the U.S., still schools are the safest place for kids. Mm-hmm. By far. Mm-hmm. There's no other safe place than schools. And it's not that they're safe because of all these surveillance mechanisms and so on, because they were safe before. The surveillance and this thing has another purpose, has a completely different purpose. It's more of a disciplinary issue than a safety issue. And that also goes back to punishment and so on. If, going back to the assumptions that we had on, the search finding something. Mm-hmm. So you find something and you get the student. So, what's the next step? Probably in a zero tolerance world that we live in, that student is going to be, suspended mm-hmm. at a minimum. Mm-hmm. So you are taking out that student, which definitely if that student has drugs in their backpack, something is going on. Something is going on. It may be, we don't know what, but something is going on. So what's your take? Let's take them out from school. Let's send them home. To probably a less safe space, not because the home is problematic, but probably it's definitely homes, including my house. It's less safe than school, statistically speaking. Mm-hmm. Statistically speaking, homes are less safe than the school. There's more violence, that happens in houses. I'm not saying my house particularly, but in houses, statistically right. speaking, than in schools. Mm-hmm. Definitely, the streets are less safe than school. Streets are safe in the U.S. in general, or at least in the area that we live in. But still, schools are safer. So you have a student that is, some issue has to be going on. Mm-hmm. If a student is bringing drugs to school, or is bringing a knife to school, or whatever you're going to find, or a weapon, or whatever thing you're going to find there. So the reaction is, let's get it out. Now, you may say, well, I need to keep all the other students safe. Fine. But that student is going to or that student is going to come back, or that's why it's a complex issue. It's a complex issue, and the measures taken in so-called safety tend to be detrimental. I'm not saying that we should ignore what's going on and so on. Okay. But that's what I was saying, that we need to understand what is the role of police, mm-hmm. what police represent, and from there start thinking, okay, what is it that they need to do and what is it that they shouldn't be doing?
There's so many things to ask. If I can, let me ask you a question from the perspective of someone else, an opinion that might not be mine. So say I'm the parent of another student that goes to this school.
Yes.
And I say, I do not want my child exposed to drugs at school. They deserve a chance to go have a safe environment where people aren't going to be trying to sell them drugs.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be tempted to use drugs. They'll be able to focus on their studies and have a safe social life and develop normally.
Yeah.
And I want the school to do everything they can to make sure there's no drugs at that school. What do you say to that?
Okay, I understand that position, and and I'm on the same position. I don't want I don't want my kid to be, my son to be exposed to negative or problematic things that happen in school. But we live in a society, so they're not exposed in school; they're exposed somewhere else. So what? The idea. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't create a safe environment and a safe spaces in school. Definitely, we should do that. But there are a couple of things here that are important. One element is that we need to provide the tools for our kids to live in the society that we live in and to transform that society. Putting them in a bubble and ignoring what's going on around, we should be able to have conversations and provide the tools and try to understand what's going on and so on. So that's one. Mm-hmm. Okay. Two, again, we go back to the effectiveness. How effective is to have a police officer and have random searches to create that safe, that free drug environment? Trust me, it's not. Okay? At least, all research shows that it's not. That drugs are going to keep coming and they're going to find their way unless we address the issue. which we're not addressing.
Which is a much deeper issue.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Yes. But then you need to think, and that's why, let me play in another way, from an extreme perspective, okay? I understand the parent, and I understand, and as a parent, yes, of course I want a safe environment for my kids and so on. But it's a different perspective when I'm designing public policy. I cannot design public policy thinking on my individual exclusive interest. I need to design public policy as a general, okay, what is it that I want to achieve? What is it that I want to transform, and so on? Okay? Let me put it in an extreme way. And I know this is a little bit of a straw man argument because I'm pushing it to the extreme. But let's say that, I become a relative of a victim of crime. Okay? Somebody close to me, which has happened. Let me be concrete. I have a cousin of my father who was tortured during the dictatorship. Okay, in prison and tortured during the dictatorship. Of course, I want those responsible to, minimum, to be tried and sent to prison and, and suffer and so on. Okay? I'm not sure that that's justice. I think that that's vengeance. And I understand. And I have that feeling. I want those who did that. I want the military who did the dictatorship in Uruguay, in which my early childhood was, and who disappeared people and so on, to suffer. Okay? Let me be more extreme for a moment. One of the architects of the military dictatorships in Latin America recently passed away, Henry Kissinger. Was I sad that he passed away? Definitely not. Definitely not. That's not justice, that's vengeance. Mm-hmm. And I understand my feeling, and I accept it. But I don't think that should design public policy. Now, I push it to the extreme, and it's a little bit of a straw man argument here, because it's a little bit extreme. But that's my point. Yes, we need to create safe environments for our youth. Mm-hmm. But first of all, it has to be plural. Mm-hmm. Cannot be just for one particularly youth. It has to be for the youth. And not only that, we need to try to address the problems of society. So if society is having a problem with drugs, okay, which I'm not sure, there is a problem with drugs. I'm not saying there is not, but, sometimes it's a little bit overblown, but still, let's address it from a social perspective and so on. Like, what do you think by going, by infusing fear to the kids, they're not gonna do it? It's like the programs. I don't know if they still have it. I think they still have it. Those, the boot camps that they would take kids to prison to scare them. Mm-hmm.
A scared straight.
Yeah, something like that. And they all every single research that has been done show that they're completely ineffective
and traumatic.
Completely ineffective and traumatic, and we still do it. Mm-hmm. So if we're still doing it, well, maybe there's another purpose that it's playing. And the same thing with the searches and so on. Mm-hmm. So if we want to address the issues of drugs in schools, okay, let's talk about it. Let's figure out what's happening. It's a complex issue. That's what I'm saying. So let me put it this way. Police represent violence. Mm-hmm. They embody violence. That doesn't mean that they apply physical violence every single time. Most encounters that happen between individuals and the police are non-physically violent. The vast majority. Okay? Many of them are. Too many of them are. But the majority, they don't include any type of verbal, physical, psychological violence. But police embody violence. They represent state authority. They represent state power. When a police is present, state violence is present. That's what we follow, the authority. We may respect the police, okay, as I respect many other individuals, but the reality is that, Walter Benjamin said that, but anyway, the law needs to be backed by violence. Mm-hmm. If not, it doesn't work. It needs to be sometimes backed by violence. And the ones who have the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence are the police. And that's why they represent, that's what they represent. And when you define a certain problem as a problem for the police to solve, what you are saying is that, okay, I need to deploy violence in order to solve it. Sometimes you need. That's why I'm saying We need to think, because it may be, I'm not saying that it is, but it may be important or maybe necessary to have police here and there in the schools, once in a while and so on. Because sometimes you need that threat of violence, at least for an urgent issue or for an immediate threat. Okay, you have an immediate threat of violence, however we define violence. You have an immediate threat. You need to deploy some type of threat of violence to prevent it or to stop it. Prevent it, I wouldn't say no, but to stop it. Okay? So sometimes you need it. But that's what the police can do. They cannot do more than that. So they're not going to solve the problem. Okay? They're not going to address the conditions and the situation that leads students to consume drugs, or adolescents to consume drugs, or to get into fights, or to deploy violence, and so on and so on. Okay? So of course we need a safe, environment for our kids to, learn and so on. But then we need to start discussing, okay, what does a safe environment means? What does it imply? And then think, okay, if the measures that I'm taking that may, from a rational perspective, provide me at an individual level safety, quote unquote, may actually be generating, when it's in a collective aggregate, it may be generating more violence. So I get, let's say that mugging is going on. That's a famous, analysis by Stuart Hall in Britain in the 70s, the mugging crisis, right? Which was overblown and so on, and had working class and racial overtones in the policy on that. But let's say that it's it. And I, from a rational perspective, I say, okay, I need to defend myself from that. I'm going to get a gun. And then the other gets a gun, and the other gets a gun, and the other gets a gun to defend itself. We may, which is a false issue, we may, become more safe at an individual level, but in the aggregate, we're generating more violence, or we are increasing the intensity of it. Okay. The same with, okay, I'm going to create, I'm going to make a fortress of my house. But you don't, you have to move out and so on. So sometimes what we believe as being logic and rational measures for our individual safety on the aggregate, they generate crises and contradictions and so on. And that's part of the problem of the system. So as maybe for teachers, and it's tough, it's definitely tough, but I would expect from, those who are making, who are designing policy at the educational level, they are responsible of having these discussions and so on. And I know for sure that they're not having it. For a fact, they're not having it. For a series of reasons. Part of it is the way that school boards are defined, designed, and how they play into the party politics in this country. But for a fact, they're not having this discussion. They're not having a discussion on how can we, address like the issue of violence, the issue of drugs, the issue of, knife violence and so on in society. They're not having those discussions. And they deploy that carceral logic, which is based on an assumption that doesn't hold, which is if I punish strongly, then,
it'll deter certain behaviors.
But it doesn't work. We're not that rational. If we were, things maybe were different, but we are not that rational.
Do you think it's all rationality, or is it a tendency of, I think about this question in terms of all kinds of public policy, especially schools. You're talking about a systems thinking approach. You're thinking about the entire community, not just the school, but the community as a system, and the types of threats and punishments that we have are very surface level solutions. They're a Band-Aid. Or they're an illusion. They're putting makeup on a bruise. The bruise is still there, but we made it look pretty. Do you think it's more just not having the habit of systems-based thinking, or do you think it's being naive to the problems, or?
No, I think that it's not having the system-based thinking, and also because it requires a deep analysis of other elements that in most places, but particularly in the U.S., most people are not willing to have. And, we need to talk about economics. And economics, let me rephrase that. We need to talk about political economy. We need to talk about that. We need to talk about the socioeconomic conditions and political conditions in which all these things happen. And we don't. We need to talk about, we are talking about drugs. In this country, since the 80s, more or less, since the 70s, 80s, drug consumption has been criminalized. Consuming drugs is a crime. They now legalize marijuana in many places. But the vision is that consuming is a crime. Drug consumption, particularly when it gets to levels of addiction, it's a health problem. It's not a criminal problem. It's not a criminal justice problem. It's a health problem. But, you want to have that conversation? Okay, we need to talk about the health system. And nobody wants to talk about that. Okay? Nobody wants to talk about that.
It's a tough conversation to admit that what you're doing doesn't work.
Yeah.
I mean, after going through prohibition in the early 1900s in this country, prohibiting alcohol and realizing that all we did was make criminals rich.
Yeah.
We still had the war on drugs, which has over the last 40 years has done the same thing.
I think that if you want to analyze a failed public policy, analyze the war on drugs, which is still going on. Still going on. Because mostly the logic was here, it was based on a very individualistic approach and a very neoliberal idea of the individual in which, as the infamous, from my perspective, Margaret Thatcher said, there's no society. There's individuals, and then when she was pressed a little bit, well, the individuals and the family. There's no society. From that perspective, everything becomes a choice. Everything becomes, it's all at the individual level. So if I'm poor, it's because I made wrong choices. If I am addicted to drugs, well, you should have said no, and so on and so on. So that, on and on and on. And if it's about the individual, then I, as a society, what the hell is my responsibility? I don't have any responsibility. You decided. You should have said no. You decided to say yes to drugs, and now you're addicted. So it's not my responsibility. My only responsibility is to keep all the others who said no safe. Right? Quote unquote, no? And that, that went into many. And in the context of the war on drugs, the whole point here, the whole logic here, and it had, other layers of interest that are complex to understand, but the whole logic here on that is, well, okay, if it's about individual choice, let's increase the cost. If I increase the cost of drugs, then people are not going to have money to buy, and therefore they're not going to buy. So let's attack let's attack the supply rather than the demand. So you've been attacking supply all over the place. So you went to Latin America and started, destroying fields and so on, cutting attacking some of the cartels and cutting the routes and, drugs, all this stuff. And what have you achieved? More violence. Drugs continue to be cheap. Drugs continue to be extremely accessible. Okay. The non-Latin American cartels, because I was listening to an interview a while ago and a guy that was involved in this thing and said people have this image that the cartels are all in Latin America. What do you think, that the drugs were distributed by FedEx here? No. You had cartels, you have U.S. cartels that were distributing the drugs. In the best case scenario, the police addressed the micro traffic, which they're still doing. Most of the people who are for traffic are micro traffic. The young kid that wants to make ends meet or whatever, selling marijuana or selling whatever. Not only that, now you can now drugs are delivered. You don't need to go to the streets to buy it.
Right.
Okay? Meth and all that stuff, all this mess. So you attack the supply by the logic that is gonna increase the price, and therefore people are gonna say I cannot afford it, I'm not gonna buy it. So you ignore. There hasn't been any type. If you look at the self-reported surveys in the U.S. in the last month, close to 70 to 75% of adults have consumed drugs, if you include alcohol and cigarettes, if you include prescribed drugs, like psychopharmacs, you're going to get to like 75, 80% or more of adults in the last week. So nobody's having the discussion like, what the hell is going on with our society? That close to 80% of adults need drugs every single week in order to, function. There's no discussion going on into that. The discussion is and the same goes to school.
Yeah. Which means
at a micro level,
yes,
it's deployed in the same logic. So let's criminalize, consumption, or let's criminalize whatever problem is going on, rather than trying to understand what is leading a student or several students to bring drugs to school, and not only that, what is leading others to buy and consume.
Why does a teenager? What are they coping with that they have to get high every day?
Yeah.
That's the big question.
Yeah. And the people who should be, having those conversations, first of all, should be the parents, which is a whole other conversation.
Sure.
But at least at the school level, those conversations should be, driven by educators, should be driven by counselors, should not be driven by a police officer. Like, I don't know what exactly happens in the middle school, but I've seen in other schools that when, comes to the famous Red Ribbon Week, the old vestiges of, let's just say no.
Yes.
Often it's police officers that come to talk. What, and they're not counselors, they're not health. So why are we putting them in that tough spot? Why are we throwing them that responsibility? They're as capable as I am in dealing with that, which is completely incapable. Okay? Yeah, I may talk as a parent and so on, but I'm not a counselor, I'm not a drug expert, and so on. Why are we having those conversations? And then you have the fascinating things that every single year I hear, that the genius comes and says, well, let's put it in the context of California. Okay? Well, I know that marijuana is legal, but it's problematic. It's a gateway drug, and I know that because every single people that I know that is hooked with meth or cocaine or whatever started with marijuana, which is a classic, problem with confusing correlation with causation.
Right.
But I remember being in one of those situations.
Yeah.
And I remember raising my hand and saying, I think you're wrong. I think the problem is ibuprofen. And the guy looked at me like, what the hell you're talking about? I was like, yeah, trust me, all the people that that are now hooked on drugs consume ibuprofen. Actually, from a theoretical perspective, I maybe have a stronger case than that guy had. Because ibuprofen is a painkiller. And it's a much stronger painkiller than marijuana. So if you're looking for painkillers, and at a certain point ibuprofen is not working, there's a big chance that you're going to go for something stronger. Okay? But regardless of that, that was my point. And at a certain point, he realized that I was fooling around and started to get angry. So I started, okay, let's talk seriously. You are confusing correlation with causation. The fact that two things correlate doesn't mean that one causes the other. But those messages are still given. And these scary tactics, they don't work. And we know they don't work. So why are we keep using it? And I think we're keeping using it because there's a different purpose that it's being trying to, it's trying to discipline, it's trying to enforce a specific social order, which that's the function of police. The function of police is to establish order. Like order not in the sense of good order, a specific social order. That's the function of police. It has nothing, the amount of time police officers dedicate to criminal law and applying criminal law, it's between extremely rare to never. The vast majority of time, they're doing, enforcing types of social order. Defining disorder, and constructing disorder, constructing order, and doing that, and so on. Okay? It's calling the police law enforcement is more or less like, I don't know, thinking that because I have a PhD, I'm a doctor that I can help someone in an airplane if he gets sick. More or less the same. Right. More or less. I'm not saying exactly, but more or less the same. What they do is policing.
Right.
So, and sometimes I'm not saying that it's not necessary.
No, I think it's very necessary, and it's... And
like in the school context, I'm not saying that it's completely unnecessary and should be, completely excluded.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to think about, because just, to make things even more complex, one of the things that we actually also know is that the moment that you start bringing police officers inside school, one of the things that you see is an increase in punishment. So you have, an increase in disciplinary measures that are punished,
mm-hmm.
and a huge disparity in who gets punished.
Yes.
And that data exists. And data exists for the district that you work.
All districts.
All districts have it, but I know the data from the districts that you work. And the disparities are huge.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know from one of the high schools, I don't have the actualized data, but I have data pre-COVID. And in the 2 years pre-COVID, for one of the high schools, which I'm not going to name, in which has around less than 3% of African Americans, they have like close to 10% of the punishment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And, it moves and it moves and it moves. And that's, if you look at aggregate data statewide or countrywide, no doubt about it, you see huge disparities by socioeconomic elements. That's number one. Class is the number one data that it's going to tell you the disparity.
Yes.
And then by race
mm-hmm.
and ethnicity. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because police are racist or something like that. The majority are not. Okay? And they're not more or less than any other institution but it has to do with the function that they fulfill in society and the way that's approached. So when, it's like, you worked in an ambulance many years.
Yes.
Bring me into an ambulance, and you're not going to solve any medical problem. We're going to starting to have philosophical discussions. It's more or less the same. Okay.
Yes. Yeah, my job as a paramedic was very analogous to the job of a police officer in that what I do is very short term mm-hmm. as a paramedic. I'm dealing with an immediate problem with some sort of immediate surface level treatment. Yeah. And I'm not in 30 minutes in the ambulance, I'm not going to make you stop smoking or start exercising or improve your diet or have different genetics or come from a different family or a different culture. Or have different, risk factors due to ethnic background and genetics and things. There's nothing I can fix.
Not only that, you don't deal with any type of prevention.
I know.
Police don't deal with any type of prevention either.
Right. Except in special programs.
Except in special programs, but the ability of police to deter crime or to reduce crime is minimal.
Yes.
It's minimal.
It's not their role.
No, but it's minimal. Yeah. I'm not saying that if they should have a place, there's the whole abolition discussion and so on. That's a completely different discussion and so on. So, I don't think it's interesting or important to go there. But I go back to my point, that I sometimes have this argument. It's like, let me put it in another context. Let's get out of the U.S. for a moment. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I was doing research on policing in Uruguay and a huge police reform that happened in Uruguay. And it happened at a moment that crime went up, not increasingly up. Uruguay is still one of the safest countries in all the Americas. But crime had a peak, had a peak and then stabilized at a high level for Uruguay. What was interesting is that the fear of crime, like Uruguay is one of the countries that people are most scared in the Americas. It goes through different processes and so on for another discussion. But I was analyzing all that process and, the policies that were deployed and so on. And part of the issue is that, the left wing was in government at that time, and for different processes, they started to adopt these tough on crime policies, mostly imported from the U.S. That's why I study you read what I read, what you read on my understanding. And I was talking to police officers, and I was talking to I talked to the former chief, for a couple of former chiefs of police and others, high authorities and also street level officers. And there was a constant. And the constant was, they throw us the responsibility of crime, and then they complain when we fail. Mm-hmm. Why the hell they throw it to us? On the first place. Now, they never said they shouldn't have, but they said this should have been approached in a much more holistic way. Now, of course, when they were the chief, they didn't say that because they wanted the budget and, a lot of other elements. It's much easier when you're out to say all these things. And then there's, political interest and bureaucratic interest. Who's going to take the lead? What are the portions? But it's clear, right, that, the ability to prevent or the ability to reduce crime is very limited if you only address it from a police perspective. So going back to the father or the parents, that it's, interested in or, concerned about having a free drug school, the police are going to have very little ability to do that. And they may have a series of other detrimental consequences in the process. Now, if you only address it through police, now, maybe there is a role for the police. I'm not sure.
Okay.
At least in the area of drug prevention. I'm not sure. In the area of violence prevention, or at least addressing violence and so on, they may have a more, if you're having an issue in your school with, fights that include weapons, then maybe the police may have a more impactful role than definitely in the area of drugs. I don't think that they have nothing to do there. But you may have it and so on, but it's something that you evaluate. But if you only address it from that perspective, you're not going to solve it. You're not going to solve it. It may be reduced at a certain point, but you're not going to solve it. And then start looking what's started to happen on the outskirts of school. And what it's like, and if you still believe that the police is the only one to do it, what's your alternative to, let's have a police officer in every corner of the city? What does it do for, for democracy? What does it do for authority? It's a series of other elements and consequences that happen. Which to a point, and this, I know you may edit it, but I find it interesting, the paradox that I've been finding recently for the last years, that the same people that come to me and complain that, the government should be out, we need less government, and, the government is not going to tell me what to, the state is not going to tell me what to do, the government is not going to tell me what to do. Those are generally the same people that tell me in the same sentence, we need more police in the street. And I'm like, what the hell do you think the police do? If not impose state, power on all of us. So if you don't want more state involvement in your life, and at the same time you cannot tell me like, oh, we need a police officer in every street, in every corner, right? So there is, so and definitely in schools, there's detrimental effects that we started talking about. Lack of trust, generating that. Labeling, it's a common phenomenon, and that's one of the theoretical links to what is called the school-to-prison pipeline, this idea that early contacts with the criminal justice system in the school, through police resource officers, through punishment, and so on, increases the probability of ending in prison. And it's an extension of what it's called the carceral state, and the phenomenon of mass incarceration that has happened in the U.S. The social problems never left. You just throw them to the criminal justice system to solve, and that's what and then you have what you have. You have more than 2 million people in prison. You have the highest number of prisoners in the world, the highest rate of prison. 25% of the prison population of the world is in the U.S. You have the highest rate by far. And this doesn't include, if you include people who are on probation and parole, you get to above 7 million. Okay? And this doesn't include juveniles and doesn't include immigration detention. So the land of the free has the most amount of prisoners in the world. We started from a micro and
we went very big.
We went very big. But this fetishism of thinking that you can police your way out of social problems is it's very problematic, and it has very detrimental consequences for a democratic society. Very detrimental consequences. I'll give you one more data. Individuals that have, the more contact you have with the police, and I'm not saying going to a picnic, I'm saying detrimental contact, imposing contacts with the police being stopping you, arresting you, or searching you, or whatever. The more you have, the less political involvement you have, the less community involvement you have. In those areas in which, in most of the working class and areas in this country, the two main contacts with the state are the school system and the police. And the school system resembles a prison. So one of the things that you have is that people don't want to get involved with the state, because for them the state is a very negative, Westland and Weaver and Westland have a good book on that. And it's, and Mary Goldschlag also is another author that, has very interesting analysis on that. And one of the things that you see is that they retreat from any type of political activity. And democracy is based on citizens being involved and participating in the political process. Mm-hmm. Now, I may understand that certain politicians, from whatever aisle they're coming, may have a vested interest in having less and less people participating. But democracy is based on citizens' participation. Mm-hmm. So if you have students that are going to become citizens, and basically the function of schools and the function of universities should be, it's not, but should be, the creation of citizens and citizenship. And what you have is people who are, want to retreat because they're afraid, because, the state has become the police, and the police is, violence and arresting and discipline and punishment and so on. But even those who have very positive views of the police, they also understand that that's the role of the police. Mm-hmm. So I can have an extremely positive view of the police. I may want to become a police officer, mm-hmm. but I understand that the role of the police is to, use force in order to impose all that stuff and so on.
I think that's true. That was my background when I was in high school. I actually liked the idea of becoming a police officer as mm-hmm. a profession, and that was mostly because of my friends. Yeah. A lot of my friends in my social group, their parents were police officers. Yeah. My closest friends, their dads were cops, retired cops. Yeah. And so we took the criminal justice ROP class in high school, and then that was my career goal for a little while. And as I started working as a paramedic, I roommated with a couple police officers. We're the same age. We knew each other from school. So I have a largely positive view of law enforcement, a positive experience, but I still understand that. Yeah. But you bring up an interesting point that not all of the children that go to this school have a positive experience with law enforcement.
Yeah, but even even if you have a positive, I have had very positive experience with individual officers. The system is different, and context-wise, my early childhood was military dictatorship, so I still have those traumas. But at the individual level, particularly when I've done research, the vast majority of individual officers that I've met, even in my job, I'm now teaching in the university, many of my students, not a lot, but some of my students have gone into law enforcement. I have some students that are there, and they're doing the master and so on. It's very positive. Mm-hmm. But still, we need to go back at what is the function and what is the the purpose and so on, and also what are the democratic implications here. Right. On participation, on engagement, and so on. Right. Police is the executive branch, and it's a very authoritative branch, and it represents state power and state violence. It's not about generating, democratic processes and dialogues and so on. They may have. There's an interesting scholarship that is coming out now regarding that argues that if it's mostly outside of the U.S. And in Brazil, there has been very strong recently that argues that, and in Uruguay also, that most police officers in those, here I would say the same. It's a little bit different, depends on the city, but most police officers come from working class backgrounds. And the idea behind it is that if police officers are allowed to unionize, and those unions are democratic unions and are unions that are part of the larger labor movement and not trade unions, in the sense that they're not looking only at their vested interest, but they're looking large and so on, then that experience, and if the unions act in a democratic way and not in a bureaucratized way, which many unions have become very hierarchical and vertical and bureaucratized, but in a more voluntary and democratic way, well, that democracy lives through the practice of it. So the idea behind it is that, if officers develop this class consciousness and this democratic experience, then they can be a much stronger force in social reform and so on. And the literature talk, at least from what I've been reading, there are two interesting examples. One is South Africa. There was one particularly police union that was very against apartheid and was very active in that, mostly by black officers. That it's still, very active and so on, and has taken part in some of the social reforms, etc. And then there's a movement in Brazil that is relatively new. It's very small, but it's relatively new, that broke into scene in 2017, 2018, which is the anti-fascist police movement. But it's the anti-fascist police officers movement. So it was in the context of the Bolsonaro presidency, who was an extreme right-wing guy, who was very much supportive of police killings and police violence, and he was supportive of some of the tortures during the dictatorship and so on. So a group of officers started to say, no, we are not that. And they created this movement of anti-fascist police officers, many of them coming from very different and varied, multicultural backgrounds. A lot of them, most of them, the majority of them coming from working class backgrounds. They belong to the civil police. I'm not going to enter into the distinctions there, but generally they are more educated than the majority of the street police officers. And they have, so that also has an impact. But the idea behind, and it's an interesting case to keep an eye on it, on how I raised the question on one of my courses is if the police can be a source for social justice. So the history of policing, not only in the U.S. but particularly in the U.S., the rise of many of the police departments, of the modern police departments, particularly in the urban Northeast, has been as part of the repression of the labor movement. So the consolidation of a professional police force has been as a reaction to the labor movement, so as a way of repressing the labor movement. And that's a history. Haymarket Square, May 1st, and so on and so on. In Chicago and in other areas. And here in LA also. Here in LA, no, I did research in LA. That's why I'm talking here in LA. Yes. But in LA also. But the idea is that, in that historical context, I raise the question, can the police suddenly become, if the police have historically been a source of repressing the labor movement, can suddenly the police become a source for social justice? And I think that, it is a theoretical discussion, of course, but I think that it has important implications. And I think that it may, I don't know, it may, particularly because of the background of the individual officers. Mm-hmm. Or at least many of the backgrounds of the individual officers. If I take many of my students who come into the program thinking that they want to become officers, basically, most, if not all of them, come from working class backgrounds. Many of them, the majority, more than half of them, are Latinos. So it's a diverse, background and so on. Many, they want to become police officers basically for two reasons: money and respect. But they have a vast experience that can, also have an impact at many levels. It's a theoretical question. My abolitionist friends are not going to like it, but,
That's okay.
Yeah, I have no problem.
There's room for all kinds of perspectives in the discussion, because it's going to bring up the nuance and things that you might not consider.
But in the school, but this discussion need to have, if we are we've been bringing, the U.S. has been bringing police officers into school for 30 years. It's not something new.
Right.
But if you're going to keep doing it, you need to discuss. It cannot be, a taken decision. I know at the end of the day, I'll go back to what I tell my students when they come to the program. And I say, if you came to the program to study criminal justice because you didn't want to deal with politics, I'm sorry. Everything is political decisions. Mm-hmm. And I think it's good. I'm not saying it's bad. Politics has a bad name, a bad reputation. But it has bad reputation because we have left it to others rather than us getting involved and, doing and being part of and so on. And it's about that. So the decision to bring, the decision and the scope and the limits and the place has to be discussed and argued. And I think the students should be incorporated into the discussion. Maybe not, like, the decision making. I would say yes, but I can understand counter arguments to that. But definitely they have to be involved in the discussions, and definitely teachers.
Yeah.
Have you been asked? No. So why not? Why not? Like, I'm not sure if the principal was asked. I'm not sure. I don't know how the process works.
I don't know the intricacies of those
I
discussions
don't have
either.
no idea. But if I asked if the principal of the record would tell me, hey man, they told me, I was never asked, I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. And I think that's a problem.
So now at my school, we have a school resource officer, and we're probably going to have one in perpetuity now, because they got it. You
never know.
You never know. But they got it funded, and it was for a reason. And I know it was a multi-year process for them to have a school resource officer. And there's a lot of focus on the positives of it. Like lunchtime fights are down. There's fewer lunchtime fights since there's a lot of data supporting the idea, at least, without looking at the things that aren't as simple as easy metrics like that, like the effect it's having on trust and political engagement.
The problem is also how we measure things.
Absolutely.
So you got fights down, which is great. That's a very important positive, and I think it's a good way of measuring. Have there been any type of analysis of why people were fighting and if that ended? No, because we are in the world of, quantitative statistics, and which are important and very important. Yes. And I use them all the time. But if that's your tool, and that's your only tool of analyzing things, then, when your only tool is a hammer, the world looks like a nail.
Yeah.
So I'm not, like, it's very positive, and I think it's important, and it's important to highlight that. But has there been any analysis of why they were fighting in the first place? And if, any of those causes was addressed? I seriously doubt, because I don't think that first question was being asked.
No, I guarantee you there's some answers. There's definitely, I can tell you from my observational, this is anecdotal, it's anecdata.
Yeah, but it's important also.
Yeah, so I've worked at this school this is my 5th year.
Yeah.
So at the end of this year, I'll have worked there 5 years. And I have good relationships of trust with the kids. So they always tell me the gossip. Mr. Schlofsky, there was a fight at lunch today. Yeah. There was, who was it? What happened? What was going on?
Yeah.
And almost every fight is girls.
Yeah.
Always girls.
Yeah.
And it's always some sort of emotional excess of negative emotions and feelings about reputation and.
But there's no addressing of that.
Right.
None.
No.
Let me put it in even a broader term. Okay. How many students have? So we are talking in the context. I don't know if the audience knows, but we are talking in the context of Turlock, in which there's 2 middle schools, a magnet one, if I'm not wrong, which is a small one, and the one that you work, which has some programs inside. So there are 2 only. How many students does yours have?
Mine is 1,400.
1,400.
Yeah.
1,400.
7th and 8th graders.
Yeah. 1,400 in the middle of a hormone craziness of teenagers and so on. 1,400 students. We should start from there, the discussion. There should be at least one more middle school. At least one more middle school, if not 2. Now, the solution should also not be like, create middle schools to make it more homogeneous. So there's a bright side of having this big middle school that brings different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds into the same place, and I think that it's extremely positive.
Yes, it's a very diverse environment.
Extremely positive.
Very positive.
The question is how you reduce, how you reduce the population without breaking that element. But you cannot have like 1,400 students and me as a parent expect you to deal with the issues of my son, you know, and having or one of the counselors to deal with, of course not. It's impossible. It's impossible. So I need order. So what? Okay, let's bring force to, you know. So yes, it's extremely important. It's very positive that the fights have been reduced.
Right.
But have we addressed the problem or the problems? Well, we may have addressed one aspect of it, but we haven't. Are these kids having less, you know, less violent outbursts in their lives, or have they learned by the fact that, you know, we have quote unquote deterred the fights? Have they learned to deal with their negative emotions and so on in a way that it's healthier?
Right.
Now, if that happened, who the hell is that police officer? Because it's like, you know, miracle maker. But no, because, you know, again, like, let me put it in other terms. Making the officer responsible for that is extremely unfair.
Yeah.
What if tomorrow there's a huge outburst of fights? Like what, the officer failed?
Right.
No.
It's like, to go back to your analogy of my former job as a paramedic. If 10 people have a heart attack tomorrow,
yeah,
does that mean the paramedics failed and we should abolish paramedics and not have them anymore?
No. But like, you know, but asking you as a paramedic to solve the problem of you know, high blood pressure and cholesterol and so on,
you can't.
You know, it's like it's impossible because it has to do with a series of layers that are way beyond your ability, your capability, and not because you are incompetent or because you don't want to or because you don't care. Because it's impossible. There are a series of layers that goes on. Okay, we go back to the issue. We go back to the issue of drugs. Why are kids consuming? Maybe experimenting. Okay, fine. Maybe like we may not agree, we may disagree. That's a different discussion. But maybe not. Maybe there are other layers of issues that are going on. And it goes back to the point, like nobody's asking. You know, when I have these discussions in my class in university, when we talk about war on drugs, nobody ever raises the question, except, you know, at a certain point I do, but nobody raises the question of why the hell we live in a society that consumes like hell, like consumes drugs like hell. What the hell is going on? And then we can start talking about other things. We can start talking about alienation. We can start talking about other elements and so on, about, you know, healthcare, socioeconomic issues, etc. But nobody raises the question because we are so focused on that element. Now, the counter argument, you know, of that is, well, I cannot talk about that elements until I have order. Yeah, but they are in a very dialectical relation. Okay. And how much of that order and then, you know, there's a paying price. Let me go to some data.
Okay.
Which is outside of school, but you know, the good old days, well, they haven't ended. But the good old days of stop and frisk, which is basically the same logic of having random searches in the school. Yeah. So you search a mass of people. Okay. 95, if not more, have absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And in the best case scenario, 5 got something. But you had to go through searches. What that does make to those people? Well, I show in my research, and many others do, that one of the many things that it creates is a sense of being second-class citizen. So yeah, I have rights, but I actually don't. And those people who feel like that generally have the same demographics. Number one, they're poor. That's number one. Okay? That's number one. And also you have and of course you have racial disparities. They tend to be poor, they tend to be non-white, particularly African American, and so on. And you're going to have the same here. Because it has to do with larger social issues. on social, and the structure of society in which, poor people, and particularly poor people of color, have been historically criminalized. So we depart from the assumption that they are criminals, right? And that's part of the issue. It's like the whole issue now. Like, I know we are going out of the schools, but it's like the whole issue with homeless. Mm-hmm. Like what? The police is going to solve the problem of homelessness?
Right.
No, but we throw them for them to solve. There was well, you don't live where you work, but I live where you work. Uh-huh. In the city that you work, there was a homeless camp that started to grow in one of the main avenues, mm-hmm. right? During the pandemic, more or less that time. Mm-hmm. And it disappeared. Mm-hmm. Did they get houses? No, they didn't. They were they were disbanded by the police, they sent them and so on and so on. And I don't know all the officers in Turlock. I know a few, and they're really good human beings and caring.
Yes.
So I'm sure that they did their best. But it's violent, the process. It's violent, the process. Even if they do the utmost, I'm scared. So then I come out and start complaining on how, terrible the police is, look what they did, how violent they were, and so on and so on. But nobody's asking the question, who the hell sent them? Because if I call the police, if I am the authority, the political authority, and I tell the police chief, to go and solve that, you cannot tell me no. Mm-hmm. Okay? If the police chief sends the officers to go and do something, they have to go. And that's when problems happen. Mm-hmm. And that's in a larger context of the way policing has been transformed in the U.S. into this idea of enforcing order, of addressing minor disorders, the whole ridiculous and unproven and unsounded broken window theory, and all that stuff that is still dominating the way policing is conducted, mm-hmm. And creates the things that it creates, and creates the violence that it creates, which is it ends being extremely people sometimes think that I have some type of anti-policing bias. I have many biases, but and maybe yes, I don't know. But let's say that you really are pro-police. I find ridiculous those camps, anti-pro, that duality.
Too simplistic.
Too simplistic. But let's say, for the sake of it, so let's say that you are from the caring side, from the pro side. If you care, why the hell you send them to do that and create you should care. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have a role, but we need to analyze and understand that there's more complex things going on. So you reduce, so that's less fighting in at lunch time. That's fantastic. That's great. Have you taken that? Not you, but has the school taken advantage to address why they were happening? How can you do it when you are teaching 5 periods,
right,
and you are dealing with 1,400 students? Well, it's not the teachers, the counselors. How 4 counselors are going to deal with that when they have to deal with 1,400 students? You're a science teacher. Do the math. How many students per counselor?
A lot. Too many. 350 kids.
I'm a social scientist. I do opinions. I don't do science. But again, how they're going to deal with that? Yeah. How they're going to analyze that?
Yeah.
How they're going to, okay, we reduce it. Now we can talk. Let's say that that's the argument. Oh, we cannot have that conversation because the fights are happening. Okay. Fights are not happening now. Or at least less than what they happen. Have you been able to address it? What are you going to ask the police officer to address it, to start talking and dealing with that also? What ability that, individual has?
I would, not to interrupt you, but I would argue that an experienced police officer probably, without realizing it, has a lot of very useful tools, because so much of what they deal with is social problems. So.
No doubt about it. But is the police as an institution the best one to deal with it?
No. A mental health professional, even beyond the school counselor.
That's my point. Yeah. When we were having our conversation, mm-hmm. you asked me, okay, the police officer is going to stay.
Yeah.
What would you do? Take the uniform out. Mm. Take the uniform and take the gun out. The police officer doesn't need a gun in the school. If if you're going to tell me the counter argument, well, why if a police shooting happened, how many police shootings how many school shootings have been prevented or stopped in time? Now, if that's the issue, well, maybe work on the response time of police officers into that.
Sure.
But even if that's the issue, maybe we should address why it's happening in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And we can. Well, but that's a discussion that we should have.
We should
be
do
discussing.
A whole other episode on that.
Yeah, well, probably not with me, but we should be discussing. If that's the issue, we should be discussing guns. We should be discussing mental health. We should be discussing all those issues.
Yeah.
But we are not. We're saying, okay, how many police officers can we have in order to prevent and so on? And it's still happening, and it has happened and continues to happen. It happens in every single of those events are tragic and could have been prevented, not by the police. So I'm not putting the police as responsible for that. Accuse me of whatever, but at least I'm not blaming the police for this. So that's that's the key element here. Okay, you're gonna have it. Okay, yeah, of course. Officers, not only officers, you also most of the teachers probably have huge experiences in their lives that are fruitful and so on. So but actually we are not using the ones of teachers. We are not using the experiences of teachers.
Right.
We are not, because we are confining you into the classroom. We are confining you there.
Limiting the role of the teacher to be a content matter expert and a, quote, purveyor of knowledge, even though we know that's such a small part.
I don't know what relations
job.
you have with your colleagues, okay? No idea. But take whatever colleague you have more or less of a relation.
Mm-hmm.
I know you tend to roam around. So let's take somebody else as an example. How many of your colleagues have spent time going to the restroom to check on students? How many of your colleagues have and I'm not blaming them in any way whatsoever. I'm sure that under the appropriate working conditions that you guys don't have, you guys would do it. But under the existing working conditions, how many of you have gone and spent time I'm not going to the restroom to police, not going to the restroom to catch the vaping.
Mm-hmm.
No, to understand what's going on and see what's happening. How many of your do you have I don't know if here in the US you have it. In Uruguay I used to have it. Do you have a school teachers meetings?
Yeah, like a staff meeting.
Meeting, yeah,
we have that
to talk about the students. We have it. We don't have it. They used to have it. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They used to have it in smaller schools because you could do it. So once every trimester they would sit down and each each teacher would go and say, okay, this is what's going on with Sebastián and so on and so on.
Mm.
How much of that you can do?
Not enough.
Under the existing working conditions, in which you can talk and say, okay, there's vaping going on in the restrooms. So now you go with that. Okay, let's send the police officer. Oh, we have less vaping in the schools, in the rest. What do you think? That's the students who are vaping stopped? I'm not saying you, but what do people think? That they suddenly stopped?
Right.
Come on, let's not be naive.
Right.
Okay, 1 got scared and stopped doing it.
Mm-hmm.
2, but in the aggregate it doesn't, and you didn't address the issue of why we have teenagers, and it cannot not all things teenagers do is because of acting out.
Right. Some of it,
yeah, yeah. Of course.
Yeah.
We all been teenagers, we all act out, but sometimes we do things because things were affecting us that we had no idea. That maybe now we are a little bit more conscious of why we did it then. Mm-hmm. But at that moment, we may not. And at the end of the day, many of us were lucky. We were not better. We were not more intelligent. We didn't have better adult references. Or we were simply lucky that forgive my language, that our screw-ups were not big enough, or that happened at a certain point that they were not that the consequences, at the end of the day, we're still sitting here. And, so I'm not of that who thinks that all times were better. But I do think that, the problems that to believe that the police can solve you the problems that you're having in schools, it's problematic, and you have detrimental consequences. So going back to the initial thing, I think that there has to be a discussion. There has to be a discussion at different levels. And yes, parents should be included, but, it's problematic also, because I want my kid to, to be safe or whatever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But so I want my kid to be safe. Maybe for my kid, because of his demographics, maybe the police is not the one that's going to make him safe. Maybe the country. To put it in the context, because, the audience, even if the audience sees me, they're not going to understand. My kids are mixed race, okay? And in the U.S., that's an issue. If I was living in one of the other countries that I lived, maybe it would be a different issue. But in the U.S., it's an issue. And my son, your student, he already had 2 problematic experiences with the police in Florida before we came to California. And basically because we were living in a context of working class neighborhoods with an overrepresentation of African Americans, and the skin color of my older son is not super dark, but it's darker. Okay, my little one, it's much darker. And I've had to have the conversations with them regarding police stops, and I've told them the majority of police officers are fantastic human beings that you should trust. However, if we are stopped by the police, this is how you need to act. Which I find it crazy. It happened to me, it burst to me when I was doing my research, both in Brazil and LA, but it burst first in LA. Like seeing mostly women telling their kids how to survive police encounters. Okay. And I've seen police officers in community meetings telling teenagers and young people and telling parents how to teach their kids how to survive police encounters, what to do if they're stopped by the police, and so on. Put your hands up, don't move, all that stuff. And for a couple of moments I said, okay, I took a couple of steps backwards, and I think, wait. We have a trained individual, but we're putting the responsibility of de-escalating to a teenager. If you think for a moment, it's completely crazy. But many of us are doing it. So let's say that going back to your question, I want my kids safe. Well, I want my kids safe too. And unfortunately, statistically speaking, the police has been a source of violence for many members of our community, particularly working class, non-white members. They have been a source of violence. So I can go with the same argument and say, I want my kids safe. So that's why that individual approach, there has to be a difference when we are dealing with public policy.
Indeed. Being in this circumstance that we're discussing at this particular school, the situation is what it is.
Yeah.
And that officer works there, or those officers.
Yeah.
Because it's not always the same individual every day. Do you think that they have an opportunity, even within the confines that they currently have, an opportunity to improve some of these issues, like trust, relationship with the police?
I do. And I think that, I don't know the individual officers that are there, but I'm assuming, having researched police in different contexts, I haven't researched it in the area that we live in, so I have no idea. But in the and I do mostly qualitative studies, so I don't generalize, or I try not to generalize. In the context that I've been, that I've done research, being a school resource officer is generally seen not as a police work by their colleagues. It's seen as less than. And so I'm assuming, and I may be wrong, that those who are school resource officers already have a sense of trying to do something positive, because they're not seen as in the myth of police work and so on, they're not seen as, the greatest, or doing police work or all that stuff, or fighting crime or whatever. Okay, which none of them do. But in this case, no. So I would assume that they already have a predisposition to do that. I'm assuming, I may be wrong. So I think that's important, and that should be taken advantage of, But again, I go again to I'm much more concerned about teachers and counselors than that. I am much more concerned. And those are the spaces that we need. We need teachers to be we need to create the working conditions for educators to be educators, and for counselors to be counselors. That's my priority. Okay, we have the police. Perfect. We have them. Okay. Fine. But that's not my priority.
Mm-hmm.
That's, as an educator, I come from a liberation pedagogy tradition and so on. I am concerned about educators. Now, if we create the working conditions that would allow, teachers to be able to do, much more than we already demand from you, more than what you do, it's important. But that's why I preface my comment on working conditions appropriate for this. That should be our discussion. How do we, rather than thinking, how can we take advantage of these officers that are there? Way before that, we need to have a discussion on what are the working conditions that we need to provide for teachers and counselors, which are the two main educators on campus, to work as educators. To get them out of I want you out of the classroom. I don't want you confined to the classroom. I want you to be able to spend the most amount of time outside of the classroom, having meaningful conversations. How many each period? 50 minutes?
Yes.
How? And then what? 5-minute break?
Yes.
How the hell you can have a meaningful conversation with anyone under those circumstances? Like, I know you have, but how many?
Not enough.
Of course not. That should be the discussion. Then we can deal with what the hell the police do.
Mm-hmm.
That's the discussion we need to have. And the problem is that, part of this incorporation of bringing the police and so on is that we slowly ignore all that. Because now they are the ones responsible of solving the fighting in the lunch break, and they are the ones responsible of the vaping in the restrooms, and they're the ones responsible of the drug selling, and they're the ones responsible of teenage pregnancy, and they are no, that's not the discussion we should be having. No, I'm telling you, but that's not the discussion we should be having.
Right.
The discussion we should be having is, I have educators. They may be good, they may be bad. That's another whole layer of discussion, which is not my expertise. But we have educators, at least in theory. In paper, teachers are educators, and counselors too. The discussion that we should be having is, what are the working conditions that we need to provide so teachers and counselors do an educational job? Then we can start arguing, okay, what the hell do we do with these two officers that are wonderful people and are here and so on, etc. Maybe we don't need them. Maybe if we created these discussions, then we don't need that. Maybe they can come and do something else rather than police.
Mm-hmm.
If they're wonderful human beings and so on, which I'm sure they are,
mm-hmm.
maybe they can do stuff that has nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. And then we can have that. But no, we need to have that previous discussion before. And the thing is that we are throwing all the problems to the police to solve. Mm-hmm. And the tools that the police, it's like I'll paraphrase a former chief of a police department, not in the city that they work, but in a close by city,
okay,
in the area, that I asked him how he feels when he has to deal with, homeless people and people with having mental health crisis. And he said, and I'm quoting, "I feel like shit, Because the tools that I have to deal with that are my gun, my taser, and my baton. Because those are the tools of a police officer. Now, of course, police officers have much more tools in their baggage, and they have much more awareness, and there's a series of other layers and so on. But as an institution, those are the tools. The tools is violence. So the discussion should be how we create the working conditions for teachers, and who are not only teachers, are also educators and counselors, to address all these issues and address all these problems and so on, and be able to provide the tools for our youth to grow, to develop, to become good citizens, to construct democracy, to have an informed public. That's the base of democracy. It's not voting. It's an informed public. Okay, an informed and active public. That's the basis. And we're not having that. And not because teachers are failing, and no, we're not having it. It's because there's no interest in having that. Let's start from there. But also because we're having the wrong, part of it because we're having the wrong discussions. I'm enjoying this conversation. It's not, but it's the point is we need to, what are the working conditions that we need to provide so you guys can actually have you already have, not only you individually, most, at least that's what I said, I'll be honest, I was very, not super optimist about the school for previous experiences, not with that school, because, and I am, I've been having a very positive experience with you guys, very positive experience with you guys. So that means that there's potential. There's a lot of potential to transform and so on. So that's how to be the point. And then once we solve that, then we can, I can come back and we can talk about what the hell, should be, how we can take better advantage of the two officers that come and so on. Mm-hmm. Maybe they can come not as officers because we're not going to need them as officers. Maybe they can come in other role, in other way, in other of the experience and so on, because I'm sure they have that. Mm-hmm. And they have the experience, and they have the knowledge, and and not only that, they have the desire. I don't know how much their position is voluntary. In some districts it is. Mm-hmm. Some districts, police officers need to voluntarily ask to become a school resource officer. I don't know if it's here. But if it is, the starting point is very good.
Yeah.
But first, let's solve the issue of teachers and counselors. Once we solve that, then we can deal with the other. Mm-hmm. But because we are not dealing with that main issue, then we are pushing. Then we need violence. We need the threat of violence to stop fights, which is it's temporary. Mm-hmm. It's as temporary as teenage hormones.
Yeah, because that is the problem: is teenage hormones.
Yeah,
and putting over 1,000 kids in one campus together.
Not only that, it's also social context, economic issues.
Yeah.
Not all kids that sell drugs are doing it because they want to buy an iPhone and whatever. Some of them, they do it because they need to, make ends meet. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not justifying. I'm trying to explain why it happens.
Right.
Sometimes I need to tell students, particularly in the way that I study state violence. So I try to explain why state violence happens. And sometimes there's a sense that are you justifying it? I'm like, no. I'm not justifying. I'm trying to understand it.
Right.
Okay? I'm trying to explain why it happens. I'm not saying that, it should. I'm saying it's not a... so in this sense, it's the same. It's not that I'm saying, oh, yeah, well, that student needs to make ends meet, so he's selling drugs. Okay, fantastic, let's buy. No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that there's I'm trying to understand why. And if we understand why, okay, we can address it. We can go into the larger conversations and so on. Okay? And the same with consumption and so on. Mm-hmm. The just say no doesn't work. Hasn't worked.
We know for a fact it does not work. You bring up a good point that the point of a conversation like this is trying to understand why.
Yeah.
Because neither of us are saying that anybody involved in this decision making is doing a bad job or has at least not malicious, right?
No, I think that there are political interests, there are political interest in having police officers in schools, sure, as many other decisions. They're not neutral. It's not such a thing. There are, and there's a political interest from the police itself, because it allows to increase legitimacy, and that means greater legitimacy for the state as it is now, not the state just as an ideal identity, but as a state as it functions nowadays. Okay? And it goes both ways. Police violence is a problem because it reduces legitimacy not only of the police, but also of the state. And the state in a democratic context cannot function without legitimacy. So, the whole, that's why the way community policing was implemented has little to do with the ideals of community policing and has to do with increasing legitimacy. And much of the decision of bringing police officers to schools and so on has to do with that. Particularly in the area that we live in. We live in an area that is the heart of mass incarceration of California. More than 50% of the prisons, more or less, are in our area. The criminal justice system have a strong political power and has a huge budget. Huge budget. That needs to be justified. And that needs to be legitimized. So the more we naturalize the presence of the criminal justice system in our communities, the more legitimate it is. But it's problematic for democracy because democracy is based not on, on the imposition of punishment and sanctions and so on, but it's based on, certain liberties and certain freedoms and the enjoyment of those things and so on. And state power, in many ways, limits those things. Okay. So it's problematic in itself. So there is political interest. I'm not saying that nothing to do with the particular officers and issues and so on. And again, that doesn't mean that it's malicious. Right. All of us have let me put it like, I'm not involved in it, but why the university does outreach? Because he wants to have a place in the community, and he wants to have legitimacy, and wants enrollment, and wants students to come. Why? Because that's money, and so on and so on. Okay? And so all institutions work in that way. It's not particularly to police and so on. And there's nothing malicious on that. So it's not. I'm not saying that authorities in the district sat down and say, hey, how can I don't care about anything, but I need to develop legitimacy. It's a more intrinsic, a complex process. There's no people in a dark room smoking whatever they're smoking and making decisions. It doesn't work like that. It's it has the inertia of the system that develops and so on. But what discussions to have are also political decisions.
That's true.
If we are going to discuss, okay, we have a problem in the school lunch fights. No, we have a problem there. We need to address it, and we need to address it from different levels. We need to have some type of threat of violence to prevent it immediately, to reduce it immediately, and we need to address the underlying causes that are dealing with that. So let's bring the police as a threat of violence to reduce that immediate threat. And let's bring the teachers in and the counselors in to identify what is going on, what are the parties involved, how are they involved, and start to slowly addressing the underlying conditions that are leading to that. Okay. And for that we need, counselors to go into the, lunch break, and teachers to go into the lunch break. Wait, but teachers, but Mr. Shuki has to teach in 5 minutes, and he has 4 more periods to go, and then he's out, because if he stays, I need to pay him extra, and I'm not going to pay him extra because the district doesn't authorize. So, Mr. Shuki, go home. Don't talk to any student. You don't have time. So we need to figure it out.
Yeah. And
those are political decisions because those imply budget decisions.
Yes.
So we need to define, okay, what's the priority here? And what's, and what are the things and so on. So those are political, and those are political decisions, and what is the priority and how do we do it and so on. And so when we decide not to have that conversation, when the answer is, I don't care why fights happen. I don't care why people consume drugs, why students are consuming drugs, and why students are selling. I want those numbers to go because that's how I report that my school is doing better in the district and in the state, and then I get more funding or whatever, because that's the reality. Okay. So I'm not going to ask that questions. I'm going to only ask the others, and that's it. But you didn't solve the problem. You hide it. It's going to explode. Yeah, but I'll be, by that time I'm not going to be. I don't know. I never met the principal, and I think she probably is lovely. So it's unfair what I'm saying, but like just for the sake of the example, by that time when it explodes, I'll be, working in the main office. I'm not going to be in the. I'm not saying that people do that, but it's like, so what questions to ask are also political. Mm-hmm. And by politics, I'm not talking about party politics. One of the benefits of not being a citizen of the U.S. is that I don't have to vote any of the parties that you guys have. So that's a benefit. Like it's a problem because I've been a resident from the U.S. for a while, and you guys are making decisions that affect me, and I have no say. But on the other hand, I don't have to deal with one more layer of incoherences in my life in which I have to say, okay, I have to vote. I have two options. I have to vote this or the other. But those are, so I'm not talking about party politics here. I'm talking about politics. Politics in the sense on how we organize the way we live in this community and in this society. That is politics, and we all should be involved. Mm-hmm. If not, somebody else is going to make the decisions for us.
So I love the idea that the solution is community involvement, because so as a political scientist, maybe you could speak to that.
Yeah.
Because the whole idea of having school resource officers at all, that's a very top-down decision, right?
Yeah.
It's not up to the principal. It's not even up to the superintendent. The superintendent receives direction from a governing board, the board of trustees, and these are elected, by definition, they're politicians. They're good people. I've met them. They're wonderful community members. But their decisions even are influenced by, ideally, in a democracy, the community.
Yeah.
Right? The voting body politic. So if that is the way it's working, like from a political science approach, like what is a solution then to, if our goal is, like you said, for the teachers to have different working conditions?
Pay them more. Let's start from there. Better compensation, more, pay them more. Teachers should be the best paid public employees in the U.S., in the country. That's my take.
Okay.
I'm not saying here academic professors. We should also, but
K-12
but definitely school. Teachers should be, like, public teachers should be the best paid public employee in the state for sure, because they have a fundamental job, okay, which is anybody involved in education and so on. So that's my take. That's what we need to address. We need to and that means. You need the money from somewhere, okay? Or you take it from some other institution, or you collect it from somewhere. So I'm going to say something very unpopular, but I'm not running for office. You need to tax. Tax the people who have more and have more money to distribute and distribute it appropriately and so on. Beyond that, okay. Several authors and several theories have had, impact in my thinking and in my work and so on. And I come mostly from a Marxist tradition, but in this case, there was an interesting book by a guy named Josiah Ober. And I'm not, it's not beyond problems. He has some problems, but he was analyzing Athenian democracy. And one of the things that he argued, and I hope no political theorist is listening because they're going to hang me on this. But anyway, one of the things that he argued was that the idea of democracy is very different than from what we conceptualize and conceive about it and so on. If an Athenian citizen would come here today, he would never think that we're living in a democracy. And basically what Josiah Ober is arguing is that the idea was to get the citizens together. And yes, who was a citizen was very limited in Athens. Mm-hmm. But still, whoever is defined as citizen, to get them together in order to, through a public and open discussion, not Twitter, public and open discussion, to solve, to define what the problems are and to try to share our knowledge to solve them. Mm-hmm. So like we're doing here, well, we're not solving anything, but we are sharing knowledge. And I have to, I cannot say whatever the hell I want. I need to more or less support it and so on. So we have different types of knowledge. I don't have the knowledge that you have as a teacher, and I don't have the knowledge that you have as a paramedic and so on. I have mine. But we come together and, doesn't matter the title that we have. We all have some type of knowledge and experience. One of the good things one of the things that I like most of doing ethnographic study and qualitative study is that the people that I interview in my work, they're not data points. They're not subjects. They're not informants. They're co-producers of knowledge. They share their stories and their ideas and their experiences and their knowledge that allow me to develop arguments. And that's it. And so in many ways we are partners in this enterprise of producing, the books that I hopefully they'll come out next year. But they are based on the knowledge that it was shared with me, that I build upon to develop the arguments that I develop and so on. And I think that democracy is about that. It's about getting together and so on. Now, it's complicated in such a large, this is more for small communities. But I think in a community that we live in, that's possible. Okay? That's why I said at the beginning, we need to get students involved. Mm-hmm. Because they are the ones experiencing it.
Yeah.
And they have their knowledge and so on. So they should be involved in the process, which is very different what happens here in our world. Like in a conference that there was this also political theories that coined the concept of we live in an offshore democracy. The offshore accounts?
Yeah.
That people hide their money and they don't know exactly where. Well, democracy is in many ways similar to what's going on now. People are the decisions are being made on our behalf that we don't know who the hell are making them, how they're making them, and so on. It's these so-called experts that are making decisions and so on, and everything is that idea, that elitist idea that only experts. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't praise knowledge. On the contrary, we should. But that knowledge needs to be, public, mm-hmm. and needs to be shared. Mm-hmm. And that's why I said the only way of having a democracy is with an informed public. We need particularly in the times that we're living. I have students at the college level that the vast majority of the information, not knowledge, but the information that they get about world issues and even about US issues is from TikTok.
Yes.
Right? So, intelligent, concerned, and, well-intended college students. And the same happened, nobody can come and argue, well, it's Stan State. No. The same happens in Berkeley, Stanford, or everywhere. Harvard, or everywhere.
Everywhere.
Okay, I see the things that they say and so on. They're getting so we cannot have and the basics, so we need to encourage participation, and we need to create the spaces of participation and so on. And democracy is messy. It's not simple, and it's not but that's what it is.
It's messy by design.
Yeah. Voting is the basics. Mm-hmm. But how many people vote? Okay. I come from first of all, I grew up in dictatorship. There was a huge struggle to get democracy back. with a lot of life being lost and so on. But I also come from a place that voting is compulsory. In Uruguay, it's a very Republican of the party, Republican the political theory. Right. It's a very Republicanist ideal that is a citizen duty. You ask me, voting should be compulsory. I'll be more extreme. I think that residents should be entitled to vote. Well, it wasn't a revolution, but a certain war of independence happened by certain people that said, taxation without representation, we are not going to accept it. And they went into war for that. Okay? To a war of independence on that. There are hundreds of thousands of people who pay taxes in this country that have no representation because they're not allowed to vote. But anyway, regardless of that discussion, I think that that's a basics. Voting should be compulsory because democracy is built through participation. You have to experience it. And experience not, sitting in my house and thinking, oh, I live in a democracy. No. Actively experiencing to build upon it and so on. And I think that's important. That's why I used to love teaching Plato, and I hate him. Because he's not a Democrat. He was against democracy. He thought democracy was the ruling of the mob. The only ones who could rule was the philosopher kings and so on. And in many ways, we are accepting those theories that only the elite experts and there's a lot of concerned citizens that participate, but also you need the conditions to participate. It's like the same with the schools. How can I participate and dedicate time for the community when I need to work 10, 12 hours to make ends meet? When do you want when do you want me to actually participate? I don't have time for that. I need to make ends meet. Okay? So democracy has to be, there's a need for a certain economic basis for that participation to happen. So that's why things are very much intertwined here and there. Now, I'm not saying that people who, there's a lot of people who have the money to dedicate time to participate that they don't do it. The vast majority don't. So those who actually dedicate time to the community is commendable, regardless of their, socioeconomic position and so on. But we need to be able to create a system that allows whoever wants. I think that we need to go even further. We need to encourage, to create the institutional incentives and even, push for people to participate. That's why I think that voting should be compulsory. I think that it's a basic duty. Not a very popular opinion, not a very popular thing in these days, at least with certain politicians that want less and less participation rather than more.
Right.
But going back to the issue of school and those decisions that are made of school, we need to involve, at a basic level, teachers, teachers, and I include counselors and so on. They should you guys should be involved in the discussions.
Yeah.
And definitely students. Students should be, at least have them participate in the discussion. Even if you don't allow them to be part of the decision-making process, which they should, but that's it. But allow them to participate in the discussion. Learn from them.
There are models for that exist.
Yeah.
By design. So when California changed its funding scheme for public schools under Governor Brown's second round, they went to something called the Local Control and Accountability Plan, where the school district decides what their needs are and how to spend their budget instead of the state dictating you have to spend this percentage on this and this many dollars on that. And that process, by design, involves students, teachers, counselors, what we call the classified staff, the bus drivers, paraeducators, everybody. And that's a really good design. And I got to participate in that this year. And it was great because I had former students in the room, and teachers of different grades, and administrators, and, people that work in food service and transportation. College professors were there. And that was a very productive conversation.
Yeah, I think, definitely. I don't know how they work, so I have no idea. I have experience with this type of organizations in other type of realms, community police and so on. One of the main problems that I've seen is who decides who can participate. And
like, how are those people chosen?
Yeah.
Okay.
Not only how they're chosen, but who can and who cannot. Like, I'll give you an example, and there's a very good book on this that two friends of mine wrote called The Limits of Community Policing, which is on the issue of policing. But I also saw it a lot in LA, also in Brazil. But I went to dozens and dozens of, community police meetings. I never saw, very rarely saw young people. And everybody in that meeting was talking on behalf of the community. I never, ever saw homeless people participating. I've seen them in the streets, living in, I've been in a meeting in which the plaza opposite that meeting, there was a homeless camp. And decisions were being made about them. Anybody, there was one place that they went out and reached out and started to talk with them and see what's going on. But everybody thought maybe we should go and talk to them to at least see what the hell is going on and why are what's the problems and so on and so on. No. Young people never saw. Very few. And the few were very, very handpicked. I see it at the level of university. I've seen there are certain committees that students need to be represented. Not always. But often, administrators tend to be very careful in the way they pick students to represent. Because they want certain voices and they don't want. They do it at all levels. So I think that the model, I have no idea. I think that the model that you just described is fantastic. The key here is how you get, a wide array of representation at least. How you because that's the point, to how to bring the different voices together. That's I think that's important. That's why I go again. Voting should be compulsory. Yeah, because if I have to, it's very different if I have to convince you only. But if I have to convince a huge array of people to vote for me, that's a different story. I could go on. I could tell you that should be public funding of campaigns and not private, but we are getting into a terrain that and should be limited. Elections happen 3 months before, you can do campaign, and it's everybody should similar pots of money and so on, etc. But yeah, we need to, I know, going back to schools, I think that, you know what? The question that you asked me, okay, we have the officers here. What the hell should we do with them? Ask the students. The problem is that you don't have time to do that. You, whoever the teacher, you don't. To really dedicate time to sit down and do it and so on. In which students can, not only that, create the atmosphere that students can openly talk to you. I work a couple of years with the youth in distress living in the streets, not in the US. And, there were tough conditions. So we would go out at night and engage with young people roaming the streets. And then we slowly we start building bridges and relations. And then we would regularly go to the same place at the same hour, the same day. And it would take us months and months of hard work. Generally I worked, but my team was volunteers. Months and months until we could build those relations. Maybe you don't need such amount of time with the students, okay? Because the conditions are different. But you need a lot of time to build those relations in order for get them to open up. And how can you when you're going to do it?
I'm not.
No, you're not. No, none of you.
No, none of the teachers.
None of the counselors either.
Right. They're inundated.
Yeah. None of the counselors either. So now what? The police officers are going to do it?
The one police officer.
The one police officer that is there and so on. And then, if there's a burst of, if something happens, we're going to blame him or her, I don't know. But like I'm going to go blame the officer for that. That's also very unfair. What if, like, you know, forbid or whatever, something happens in the school tomorrow? Well, tomorrow is holiday, but, you know, when we come back, when you guys come back, what, we're going to blame the officer? Because that's what's happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what happened. Oh, the officer was an incompetent that couldn't stop and perceive and so on and so on. And we need we need an officer that, things that I've heard, you know, during my research, in other words, the officer became too friendly with the students and, you know, things like that. You always, like, so we blame. No, why?
For becoming too friendly? Seems like that's what you want.
Sometimes, yeah, but sometimes, you know, yeah, but what's the point? Like, we always find the excuse to blame someone. But my point is, if you go back tomorrow and suddenly there's an outburst of fights during lunch, that means that the police officer failed. That's how it's going to be perceived.
Mm.
Yeah. And that's why part of the issue is how we measure things. Because then the next step, which is what happens in the streets, is, okay, if there is violence, we need to measure how much arrests and so on are doing. So now we're going to measure how much discipline is happening. And what, we're going to go back to, well, back no, because in some places you still have it. Are you going to go back to the quotas? Are you going to implement quotas? Well, in order to know that you're doing an effective job, we need to know that, because let me put it in that terms, no more school fights. No more school fights. Oh, fantastic work. No more school fights and so on. 6 months go, a year goes by, no school fights. Why do we need a police officer? Somebody's going to come and say, like, hey, we are spending, I don't know, $1 million, probably more, $1 million a year for the school resource officers, but there's no incident. Why the hell do we have them?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we don't need them all day long. Maybe we need them half a day. And then it happens again. And, you know, the metrics so that conversation starts happening. Now, the police officer is not going to go and tell the students, hey, you need to start fighting. Because if not, I'm going to lose my job. But one of the consequences that we have it at the level, no, I'm not talking at the level of school, but yes, at the level of the street, at the street level, is that suddenly you have bursts and arrests.
Mm-hmm.
Because I need to justify my job. So quotas existed. There's enough evidence that shows that arrest quotas existed and in many places continue to exist, allegedly. So nobody can hold me. Allegedly, they tend to exist.
Mm. Even if they're unspoken, like, expectations.
Yeah.
I mean, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. If everybody fails your class, then there's a problem.
Yeah.
The same happens if everybody gets an A.
That's a problem.
Although
too.
I was reading the other day that A has become the mean in many courses in elite institutions across the country, which talks about the great inflation. But yes. Going back to the point again, you know, yes, officers can improve. Okay, so you have the resource officer working on job, because this happens in the streets also. You have I'm going to talk about LA, which is what I know, okay, more than other places. So in LA, you had the senior lead officers, which were the officers that dedicate themselves to community policing. Mm-hmm. All their colleagues think that they're playing around and they're not doing police work. And they deal with that, they cope with that, and they do that, and so on and so on. Okay, so you know you have those situations that are problematic. So you have them, you know, in schools also. I lost my train of thought for a moment. But what I was going to say, I don't know. Lost my train of thought.
That's okay, man. We've been talking about it for a couple hours already. We got deep.
That's the problem with academics. You know, we love talking. we don't stop talking. We don't stop talking. What I was gonna say about it, can't remember. I lost my train of thought. Anyway,
that's okay, man. You've said a lot. Thank you for taking the time.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure.
It's so nuanced, but the points you make that, like, There need to be nuanced discussions.
Yeah.
And not just see things as, oh, that's an easy solution. Like deeper discussions, root cause analysis, systems-based thinking.
Yeah, and try to look at this is what I was going to say.
Okay.
Okay. So you had these situations in which the senior lead officer would do a lot of hard work in building relations, in trying to gain trust, trying to get, the youth to understand, try to, convince other officers not to go and arrest immediately, not to take, a lot of other stuff. And suddenly, whatever happens, or I don't know, and then, at least in the context of LA, Metro Unit, which would be the SWAT-style unit, comes in and does their stuff. And all that trust is suddenly lost. So put it in the context of the school. So you have this officer, starts building trust, starts doing all the stuff, and so on, and suddenly, the district or whoever commands, makes the decision, does a random drug search in the morning, like happened in my son's classroom. All the trust goes to hell. All the trust goes to hell. If I am a student, and you are the police officer, and I trust you and so on, and suddenly I came to my class, and suddenly you're doing a random search, in which, like, I have nothing and so on, I'm fine, but, like, what the hell? Like, why are you doing, why? Or you start searching, like, you're going to, like, at least in the I'm not sure about this, but in the context of the school, you cannot search me without my consent, but you can search my backpack. You can search my locker. So suddenly you decide to search the lockers, and you're searching mine. Even if it's allowed, and even like, and that, the stupidity of, oh, well, if you don't have nothing to hide, then you shouldn't be concerned. Yeah, well, you know what? I want to live in a place that I am not considered a suspect. And that's part of the problem, because at a certain point, when you treat me as a suspect, on and on and on and on, when you treat me as a criminal, on and on and on and on, you know what? At the hell, I'm going to start acting like one. Because if that's how you treat me, I'll become one. Victor Rios has a very good analysis on this on Oakland. What's the name of the book? Victor Rios.
I'll find it. I'll put it in the notes.
One is Human Targets. That's the second one. But there's another one. The name blew up my mind. But Victor Rios. He has a good... And he actually looks at young people, young Latinos and black people in Oakland, the concept of Oakland, and also deals with the issues of school. And one of the things he shows is based on the, labeling theory and so on. You attach a label to me, well, I'll start acting as the label, if that's what it is. And that's part of the issue that's going on here. So yeah, you have these officers building trust, and then a random search happens.
And that trust is now undermined.
Yeah. Not only that, like, let's say they do a search and they find something in the classroom. So now I don't trust my classmates. But beyond other things, because collective punishment is something very typical in school, so I imagine that may also happen. So I don't trust my classroom. I don't trust my classmates or whatever. There's a lot of things that are problematic, that have strong detrimental consequences on those type of activities. For me, the biggest one is that it hides the real conversation that we should be having, the real conversations that we should be having. And one of those is, okay, what is the role of teachers here? And what should be? And what are the conditions that we need to do in order for that role to be? Let me be blunt. If they bring a police officer because there are fights in the lunchroom, okay, that's because you're failing. But yeah, you're not doing your job, so I need to bring an officer to do it. If I bring a police officer to talk about the drug addiction, instead of having the teachers or the counselors doing, or a health worker doing, basically what I'm saying is that the health worker and the teachers have no ability to do it. And here we are. Yeah.
Because that kind of is the reality of the situation, because like you said, the working conditions, we don't have a lot of ability.
No, you have no ability whatsoever.
to do what in an ideal situation we'd be able to have more impact?
No, you need to, first of all, you need to, reduce the amount of students. That's number one. Like, I don't know, but definitely you need to reduce the amount of students. Definitely. If there's 8 periods with 0 period.
7 periods with 0 period.
7 periods. I cannot have a teacher teaching more than 4 periods. And I need the other periods for the teacher to be, because I cannot only, because I say, okay, I don't know how it goes here, but in Uruguay, for example, very few teachers work full-time in one school. They work in many. So you get 4 periods in one, and then you go and rush to the other one to complete the other periods. If not, you don't make how you're going to make money. Well, money you're not going to make, but how are you going to pay the bills?
Right.
So I don't know if here is the same. I don't know how it is. If you have double work.
There are some positions like that, but most teachers are dedicated to one school, one site.
But okay, so so if you're dedicated to one side and so on, okay, I need you to be here all the periods, and be able to dedicate time to deal with many issues. Now, maybe not all the teachers. Like, I think that all the teachers, but maybe not all. Maybe have a group of teachers that has some type of release time to dedicate to education. You teach in the classroom, but then you have the significant moments. The classroom is not a significant moment. And it happens, but you have it with what? 1, 2, 3 students. In the best case scenario.
Right.
Okay. The significant conversations are long.
Yes.
Significant conversations are longer than this yeah. And this has been long.
Yes.
But they're long. Significant conversations are long.
Yeah.
Like, it happens with my students, and they're much older. Like, I have every once in a while, and particularly, like, I teach in Stockton also, and they happen there, and I know that I'm going to stay hour and so on. But I don't have the time. I'm not being paid for that time, but I make the time. But I have that possibility because I can stay on campus. You cannot stay on campus, and students don't stay on campus.
Right.
Okay. But I finish my class at 7, and sometimes a student says, like, hey, I have a question, and we go to the office, and I ask, like, how you doing? And the problem starts, and I can stay. But not every day, of course. Once in a while, and I have much less students than I have, and so on. But still, that's the issue. We need to create the conditions for you guys to do that. And maybe maybe we cannot. Maybe we don't need. Maybe then we don't need police officers to be in schools. And if yes, we may be able to need them for very specific things that are very well defined. Or maybe we can take advantage of that stuff. But still, the focus should be on the focus should be on you guys and the counselors. But that's the reality. The reality is that we have transformed. Well, we know, you guys. I'll take advantage I'm not being a citizen for a moment. But yeah, the U.S., it happens in many other countries in the world. It's not particular to the U.S. But the U.S. has basically criminalized. It's not new. Historically, it has happened. But it has criminalized the majority of social problems. So, so you try to solve them through a gun, a taser, and a baton. And you're not going to solve it like that, but anyway.
That's a lot to think about, man. My goodness. Why don't we end it right there?
Yeah, well.
Thank you so much.
No, my pleasure.
This is great to have this conversation again and think about the same ideas.
Yeah. I always tell my students, you need to go to professors' office hours and so on, build that network. And they ask me about what to do. Ask one question.
Yeah.
And we will talk for ages. We love talking. We laugh our ego being busted and thrown up and so on, and we talk and talk and talk.
That's great.
No, thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
You know, I think it's important. I am, you know, it's a little bit my world, and I have vested interest because I have, you know, my kids in the system, and you know, I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but the present is that I live here. So, you know, and I've been living here for a while. So whatever happens in the schools, one thing or another affects me. And, you know, yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure. Do you want people that hear this, you want them to be able to get a hold of you? Or
yeah,
I can put your website in the show notes if you like.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
Okay.
No problem.
What about your email? You want people to be able to email you?
They can email me directly. Like if they go to my website, there's a link to my email.
Okay.
But I can give you my email or my email. Should I give them my personal or my work?
Whatever you think.
So I'll give my work just in case. So my work email is JSCLOFSKY@CSUSTAN.edu. Yeah.
Yep, that sounds right.
Yeah, that sounds right. But yeah, if you know, Jake is gonna put my website. You are welcome to see whatever other crazy things that I've been doing, and feel free to, you know, reach out.
Yeah, there's a comprehensive list of things you've done recently and more distantly. I didn't know you went to law school.
Yeah, I started in law school in Uruguay. After, you know, I've been around. I had been already 1 year, you know, volunteering in Israel, and then I lived in Brazil and I worked there with young people, and then I came back to Uruguay and I started law school. I didn't finish, you know, strikes, occupations, all the fun stuff. And at a certain point, you know, country was going into a political and economic crisis, and I was a little bit stuck. Still trying to complete the exams of previous years because of strikes and occupations, which were reasonable and logic, but still. And I had friends that had already immigrated to Israel, and I started exploring the possibility, and I got accepted with a scholarship to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So I decided to leave Uruguay and go and study there. So I left, and story short, I studied there. I did my BA and my master, worked, got married. My older son was born there. And then for different reasons, we were looking for, you know, other alternatives and situations and so on. And I got a scholarship to study at the University of Florida to do my PhD in political science, which we came to the US and spent quite a big chunk of years in Florida. My youngest son was born there. I did my research on the experience of residents of South LA and Sao Paulo's periphery with the police and with police violence, which hopefully a book is coming out next year on this.
Great.
Yeah, I got, you know, starting to get the revisions and starting to work on that. And I got a job at Stan State. And in 2018, we moved to Central Valley. And we've been here since then.
And here we are.
Yeah, doing some other fun stuff in the meantime. So I've been around. I lived like most of my life in Uruguay. I lived in Brazil, lived in Israel, now here in the US. Without, you know,
and California and Florida, which are not the same.
No, not at all.
They're like different countries in a way.
Oh yeah. Always, like, you know, a little bit in Florida was a little bit. We were living a little bit of a bubble. You know, college town,
sure.
Gainesville, strong college town, and you know, we were living in university housing for families and graduate students. So we very diverse community from people from all over the world, most, you know, students and so on. So it was, you know, it was a very nice bubble, but it was a bubble.
Sure.
And here, you know, we all have bubbles. So yeah. So we've been here in California for the last 5.5 years.
Well, selfishly, I'm glad you made it here because
I'm very, it's a nice place. A lot of potential and a lot of really good things. We like it here. We've been here, and we have no plans of moving, at least in the meantime. But you never know. I never thought or dreamt or aspired to live in the U.S., and I've been here for more than a decade. So you never know. Never heard of the Central Valley before, and here I am, almost 6 years already.
Wow.
So you never know. Always open to adventures. Well, now I'm starting to get settled, but if I have to say something, be open to adventures. You never know.
Yeah.
And it's fun. Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Sebastián.
Thank you very much. Yeah. My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. All right.